I am here to talk with our panelists about practicalities in getting tiny homes here in Chicago. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists who will then talk more about their work, and then we're going to get into some conversation and Q&A from me and you all. So first we have Andy Geer, who is the Vice President and Market Leader in the Midwest region from the Enterprise Community Partners. Next, we have Lydia Stazen-Michael, who is the Vice President of Development and Communication at All Chicago. Okay. I don't see Lydia. Okay, well, Lydia will be here. Next, we have Katrina Van Valkenburg and also Christine Haley. Both are from CSH. Katrina is the Central Region Marketing Director. Managing Director, my apologies. And Christine is the Associate Director. And finally, we have Carlos De Jesus, who is the Managing Director of Housing at Heartland Human Care Services at Heartland Alliance. So before I turn it over to everyone to talk a little bit more about their work, just to give everyone an idea, when we chatted a little bit on the phone in preparation for this panel, we talked about different themes that we wanted to go over and focus on. So one of the biggest things was how work actually gets done in Chicago. We've heard about how it works in Texas and Tennessee and Washington State and North Carolina, but we also need to talk about what's happening here in our city. We also want to talk about what funding looks like, what interactions with neighborhoods and politicians looks like, and what zoning impediments or benefits we may have here in Chicago. So with that, I will turn it over to Lydia.
Me.
Oh, well, not Lydia, actually. The Turkish lady's not here. I'll turn it over to Katrina.
Great. Hi, I'm Katrina Van Valkenburg, and I'm with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, and we're a national nonprofit that works across the country to develop housing with services for vulnerable populations. So we're very interested in supportive housing for youth and supportive housing for people who are homeless. To give a little sense of some of our work, we do both training and technical assistance, we do policy work, but we also do lending. We're a CDFI organization, a community development financial institution. So for instance, the cottages out of Dallas is a project that we lent money to help make that project possible, just to give you a little sense of some of the things we do. On a personal level, in addition to my work, my husband back in the early 90s was a member of the Madhousers. Does anybody know who the Madhousers are? Raise your hand. I see there are two people. But so it was an organization in the early 90s that really looked at how to create basically small shacks for people who are homeless and living outdoors and use it as a way to kind of really say, look, people are here. And every time you see one of these shacks, we want you to know. It was an advocacy project. As soon as one was built, eventually they were torn down. But for me, the Madhousers project was an important project in a history and time, but for now, that's not what we need. What we need is housing. So I think when we think about tiny homes, we need to think about them as being different from shacks, right? We need to think about them as housing that meets housing quality standards for people. The other project that I've been involved with is with the Rural Studio, and there are some folks here who have also been part of that. And the first project back in 2003 that really captured my imagination was a project they built for someone named Music Man. And it was the first time I had seen what basically was a small house that was built like a studio apartment in a rural community. And it really opened my eyes to the idea of how in rural communities this could be really contextual housing, to have small houses for people, and that it looked like what neighbors had. So when we think about supportive housing, we're always thinking about how the services themselves can change as people need them to change. So if you don't need services right now, that those services can stop until you need them again, but then when you need them again, they come up again. The study this morning talked about that need, especially for youth, that you may not need something right now, but a year down the road you may need something. How do we provide those kinds of supports? And that's what we really think about when we think about permanent supportive housing. One of the challenges that I really think about a lot with any scattered site supportive housing project, and especially tiny homes, is the question of how we're going to do property management well. So how will those properties be good neighbors in a community? Are the tenants able to shovel the walks or cut the grass? Do you need to have a service that does that? How do you ensure that that happens so that if you're the neighbor, you feel really good that the investment in your home is protected by how the property is being taken care of? And when we think about siting, that's hugely important. And the other piece I think about a lot is this quality supportive housing piece. It's really important that it's a house, that it has a bathroom, it has a kitchen, it may look like a house and act like a house. Somebody should be able to move out of the house and a new tenant move in. It shouldn't be destroyed when somebody moves out, but it really is a small version of a house. And I think that's a really important piece. And that piece that Mary mentioned about meeting housing quality standards is critically important as we think about what we're creating, what we want to invest our public money in, and why it's important for the tenants who are living there. And one of the youth said earlier, I don't want a toy house. And I think that's a real challenge for us. How do you make a small house that doesn't look like a toy? And I think in the design, that's probably part of the question. It's really important in affordable housing and in supportive housing to think about how can housing be contextual. So if the tiny houses are next to your house in your community, how do they look like your house? How does it not feel like a tiny little village, but how does it feel like something that's part of your community? How is it integrated into the community? Is it how you site it? Are there other approaches? But that becomes really important that it doesn't look like an anomaly, because our challenge in affordable housing is that we only have this much money, but we want our house to look like our neighbor's house that had this much money. So how do we really do that? I think that's a really big question. And then I think the other one I think about a lot is community integration, and that we don't want our tiny houses to only be for people who are homeless. We don't want people to drive through communities and say, homeless people live here because it's tiny, or homeless people only deserve something that's tiny. So how much do we think about it as an affordable housing option we're adding to our community that homeless people may live in, but so may somebody else who's never been homeless? How do we think about that? In my head, I know this isn't a tiny house, but I think if we could, this is a little personal statement on my point, but if we could add studio apartments above our garages like we used to have with carriage houses, we could add a lot of affordable housing to our community. We could have youth who move into those apartments above as a carriage house apartment. They could have natural supports from the family who lives there, like it could be somebody who lives behind my house who could come to me for support, but could also pay rent and have their own apartment. I think there are lots of ways we can think about this. And then zoning is just a huge challenge. And I don't know if I can state that enough. I think I'll say it again. Zoning is a huge challenge. And the panel that comes after us may be the most important panel you see all day, because tiny houses don't fit within existing zoning. And it's just really important that we're able to see, to even be able to do it, we have to make some really big changes and get agreement on it.
Hi, again, I'm Christine Haley with CSH, and I work for our Illinois program as our Associate Director. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how tiny homes can be part of our solution as we look to end youth homelessness by 2020. As Mr. Willis talked about earlier, that with Opening Doors, our federal plan to end homelessness, there are goals to end veteran homelessness by the end of this year, chronic homelessness by the end of 2017, and then family and youth homelessness by 2020. I'll talk a little bit about how we're using our veterans work here in Chicago as a framework for how we might end youth homelessness by 2020. So here in Chicago, our local work is for veterans is called the Ending Veteran Homelessness Initiative. Many of you in this room are part of this initiative and part of this solution. And in this work, I think there are 4 key takeaways that we have at this point as to what we're understanding of how this works. One is that we have a by name list of veterans, so we would need to do that same process with youth experiencing homelessness. So having a list by name of everyone in the city of Chicago at this moment who's experiencing homelessness. The second piece is that we have both a community team made of providers who collaborate weekly all across the city, as well as an advisory board or leadership team that has the political will of key agencies such as the VA, the City of Chicago, and both the Mayor's Office and DFSS, the Housing Authority, HUD, All Chicago, our Continuum of Care lead, we at CSH and others, and the VA. And in that, there's enough, we meet weekly and have constant discussions about, are we implementing the strategies that we've identified? The third is that we have a coordinated access and triage system, and that there is one centralized point of access for homeless dedicated veteran resources. In that, there is a triage tool that is used to determine if a household needs supportive housing or a rapid rehousing or some other short-term intervention or VASH. In that, we have already created here in Chicago a tool for youth that was developed with CSH along with our partners at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, Unity Parenting, TLP, the Night Ministry, Heartland Alliance, in which we look to identify which are the youth who are most likely to end up long-term homeless. In that, we at CSH in our LA office, along with Dr. Eric Rice in LA, developed the indicators to identify those. So we do have a triage tool that we can use to identify who might need supportive housing, or who might need a lesser term intervention. And then the fourth piece is understanding what our housing capacity is. That do we have the housing resources available now that we've assessed folks and know which households might need supportive housing, which might need a shorter term intervention? Do we have that housing capacity? And so we're working to build that within the veteran community. We know that we do not have that yet within the youth providers, that we do not have the housing capacity to do that. And so how can tiny homes be part of that solution? I think there are 2 pieces that we've identified for moving forward that we'll have to think about if we want to end youth homelessness in 2020. One piece with the housing capacity is, do the homeless and housing service providers have the capacity to expand? And to be able to provide those services, and what support do those agencies need to be able to expand? I think that we heard on the previous panel about what resources might be available for sponsor basing, for example, but do the providers currently have that capacity to expand, especially since we've had such a struggle with state budgets and agencies staying open with their current capacity? How do we expand that capacity? And second, how do we align services dollars for supportive housing developments if some service funding ends at 24? So when a youth, on the day that they turn 25, how do we ensure that their services funding and that they're able to maintain that housing unit past 25? And I know that the services panel that's going to come up later today will try and address those questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos de Jesus. I'm Managing Director of Housing at Heartland Human Care Services. And Heartland Human Care Services is one of 5 companies or organizations that make up the Heartland Alliance. And as Ray Willis was saying earlier, Heartland Alliance evolved out of Traveler and Immigrants Aid, which was started in 1888 by a well-known social worker in Chicago who started so many other organizations, Jane Addams. So we're one of the many organizations that she started so many years ago and that are still vibrant and working. In Heartland Human Care Services, we have a variety of programs that we provide. Heartland Alliance in general is an organization that's dedicated to dealing with human rights. And the primary focus of the organization is eliminating poverty. Now that's a bold statement to be sure, but it's what we work at day in and day out. I specifically work, as I said, on homelessness, and we have a broad range of programs. It's a full-scale, well, almost full-scale of programs, ranging from transitional housing to permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing. But one of the areas that I found that we are not doing a lot of work in is working with youth. We need to do more as an organization, but I think it's reflective of the amount of resources that are available. The other area that we don't do a lot of work in, also as a result of the lack of resources, is the doubled up and tripled up families. And also that has to do with just the way that policy and the priorities that are set forth to deal with homelessness, it sort of precludes us from being able to address that population. But we are working diligently to address homelessness at any, really in the past number of years, we've helped over 1,200 families transition from homelessness into stable housing. And so we're set to do that, and we're really energized and excited about the possibility of tiny homes. That's an area that we certainly have not been involved in, but are very interested in exploring.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lydia Stazen-Michael. I work in the Development and Communications Department at All Chicago, and I apologize for being a few minutes late. I just straight up got lost on this campus. So All Chicago has three primary programs. One is our emergency fund, which provides micro grants to people who are experiencing a crisis or a transition that could lead to homelessness. Our Chicago Alliance program, show of hands, how many people know what the continuum of care is? Okay, good. This is my kind of audience. So we are the backbone support agency for the Chicago Alliance. So working on the collaborative application for funding, staffing lots of different community committees, and helping to implement the decisions that the continuum of care makes. And then our third program area is called the Learning Center, where we bring in lots of different people to speak on lots of different topics and promote best practices. Our staff does a lot of trainings, particularly around the HMIS database, the Homeless Management Information System database. So we're kind of sitting at the center or the hub of this system in Chicago. I see lots of our partner agencies out there in the audience. And so we work with lots of you on that. And so with this perspective, we're really interested in how can we take this tiny homes idea and plug it in and integrate it with a lot of different initiatives that are happening so that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing and that we're all working together. And we're really excited about the tiny homes ideas. We've been talking about this for lots of years before even I came on staff at All Chicago. I think those were, that was one of the first new initiatives I learned about. So it's really exciting to be here in this room and to see everybody coming together and thinking about this and making it happen here in the city. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andy Gear. I'm the Vice President and Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners. I run the Chicago office and Detroit office for Enterprise. We're a national nonprofit like CSH that focuses in on really where we have market offices advancing the capital, programmatic, and policy solutions towards affordable housing. But not just the housing itself, but also thinking about the importance of the connection of the housing to opportunity for low-income families or homeless individuals. So we're very focused in Chicago. Prior to joining Enterprise, I actually ran Heartland Housing, the housing arm, the development arm for Heartland Alliance for 14 years. So have spent a fair amount of my time, as I say, pushing that rock up the hill. So That's what we're trying to do. Is I'm going to try to bring a little bit of a developer perspective to this discussion. We're seeing, obviously, from the competition, some fantastic design. Chicago has some of the world-class architects here that can really know how to design initiatives to be responsive to this. We also are hearing from the government panels about a willingness to start to think differently. And then we're hearing about a lot of the barriers. At the center of all this has to be a developer. Has to be somebody who's willing to advance these projects and do it, take some of that financial risk, also work with the community. In my experience, I've been doing this type of work for about 20 years now. A project gets done when a project is financially feasible and viable. And that's not to say that it has to be a market rate housing. There are many affordable programs to do that. When you have the community will behind you, and when there's political support. So those are the dimensions that we were always pushing on as developers, is trying to make sure that we were aligning those three areas to make a project a reality. As we looked at it, and as I look at the tiny homes solutions here that are being presented, what I would encourage is trying to bring in the development community sooner rather than later, because you've heard about the zoning challenges. You've heard about building code issues. You'll hear about the community acceptance issues. Having a mission-driven developer as part of those discussions is going to be important for advancing this work. Then as you start to think about, piloting this work, I think we have to have, because, starting with a pilot project, and we know about the need and the demand for this type of housing, we really have to do more than just one project. We have to do multiple projects, and we have to scale up this type of work as a potential solution. So a few thoughts around that, and how do we scale up this initiative. One is, I think we have to establish a marketplace for this, not only within the youth homeless systems, but also, is there a broader marketplace within the city of Chicago for the tiny home concept? A couple ideas that I have around this area is, one, we have to start to think about exploiting the intersection of the tiny homes movement and the sustainability movement. When Chicago first started doing sustainable green development 10, 15 years ago, actually probably 20 years ago, but I remember being in meetings with Doug Farr, who is a world-renowned architect around issues of sustainability. And his basic premise was, we'll probably break almost every rule in our building code and our zoning to achieve sustainable green housing. And we've done that. We've advanced the movement. Now in the city of Chicago or throughout the state of Illinois, there's very few, if any, projects that aren't developed to a green standard. So we have to sort of establish this marketplace around the tiny homes movement. And I think there's some intersections between the sustainability movement. We're hearing about how youth, and not just homeless youth, want to live in a city. They're wanting to be connected to opportunity. They want to be close to transit. They don't want a car. I think there's a lot of intersection to explore to establish a marketplace for a tiny home and tiny home models in a place like Chicago that we need to be talking about. And then third, I'd like to talk a little bit about the financing challenges. We've heard, and I think everybody should have noted what Mary Howard said about being able to get vouchers into meeting HQS standards. That's going to be very key for developers to advance these types of projects. But it's going to be a challenge to get developers to really take on projects of this scale. One is, you're going against the tide of bigger is better. That's sort of, there's more efficiencies in doing a larger building or more buildings and more complex projects. But we have the benefit of, if we're able to lower our cost, that's where we're going to get some receptiveness. If people are looking at what it costs to build an affordable housing unit in the city of Chicago, and if we're able to do it for a third here and serve a need and a purpose that is meeting the need of the market, there's a lot of intersection there. But I think we have to think about it from a scale perspective. So not only how can we pilot one project, but also do that. I think the financing is going to be challenging up front, so you're going to need some patient capital to help with the planning process, to help a developer work through architectural entities, groups like CSH, Enterprise, LISC. I saw Barb Beck here earlier today. All have patient capital tools to try to assist in the development of these projects. But there's going to be a need to long-term sort of develop some more permanent financing models for this, because our traditional housing finance system isn't really set up to develop these 11-unit tiny homes villages. So I think there's going to be a lot of challenges there. I think we also have to start to think about potentially how do we work within the philanthropy, working on trying to arrange PRIs to potentially help fund these construction costs. But the importance here is really to, if we can deliver units more cost effectively, you're going to get the attention of the government. You're going to get the attention of the community. And then we'll be able to scale these projects up. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about, at least in the introduction.
Great. So just to start the conversation, both on this panel and in other panels, we've talked a lot about youth homelessness. And even within that community, there are some young people who are more vulnerable than others, including youth of color, LGBTQ youth. What relationships do you all feel need to be built up to ensure that when you're creating these tiny home developments, that you're getting the resources, the services, and the word out there to those who are most vulnerable within these communities?
I'll go ahead and start, because when I was at Heartland, we had just been selected to develop the Town Hall Police Station site up in Lakeview. And so had worked with the Center on Halsted around that development. And I think the importance is really strengthening the relationship between the mission-driven developers and the service providers. And trying to make sure that those connections that you're working, they're going to be the ones responsible for providing services, but you need to have a developer that is willing to, again, build the units, and as Katrina pointed out, sort of be involved in the long-term management and the financial viability of those properties on a long-term basis. So I think some of the existing relationships are there, but I think we need to do more to broaden the discussion between service community and the development community.
I would agree with Andy in that I think that there are established groups that could be reached out to. I think the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless Youth group does a lot of very impactful work and reaching out to the providers and to the youth that participate in the coalition. I think that with our unfortunately, as segregated as our city is, I think that part of this is really ensuring that that the voices of youth who are on the south and west sides are also incorporated into these discussions. So, so that as we work towards identifying where to have these conversations, really ensuring that we have that diversity across the city.
Yeah, I think it's important to have the appropriate relationships, right? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of making sure that the focus is on those homeless youth that are of color, that are LGBT, in the LGBT community. We have, at Heartland, we've had a longstanding relationship with Center on Halsted. In fact, we've been working with Center on Halsted on creating a campus, a homeless youth campus. And so that's still in the planning stages, but it's clear that the need is there. But I think we also have to take a look at the fact that someone mentioned this morning that CPS indicated that there were over 20,000 homeless students in Chicago. And what inroads are we making with CPS? What inroads are we making with communities where this is so prevalent? So absolutely, networking is essential to be able to address the needs of that community.
I also would add to sort of remember what I said before about sitting at that hub of the system in Chicago that's working to end homelessness. It also reminds me of what Christine was saying about the veterans and the coordinated assessment process that we have with them. So what are the systems that are already in place to identify which housing solution is best for what particular type of person, and making sure that we're using our databases and our learning center as ways of connecting people into this new initiative. I think this, if we do get some tiny homes launched, it's going to be a very exciting initiative, and people will be reaching out to all of our different organizations to find out how they can plug their participants into it. So making sure we think that through, and who are we communicating it to, and when and why, and making sure that it's all flowing together to make sure that the people who are most at risk and are most vulnerable are getting matched with that housing solution that's best for them.
Did anyone else want to add? No? Okay. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, but if you don't have questions, I have plenty more to pose, so no rush. Another question that I had, which I think is something that every person on every panel is probably thinking about, is how do you continue to finance and build and make sustainable tiny homes, especially when there's a chance that this tiny homes fad and all the HGTV shows may go off the air and people will stop talking about it. So what are your plans for the future? How do you plan on keeping this in people's minds and keeping people thinking that it's a viable option for homeless and non-homeless people?
So I think that with any housing solution, it's up to us to make sure that we have the metrics and the evaluation tools in place to show that it's a solution. And once we can demonstrate with the data that it is a solution that is ending homelessness for people, it will be much more than a fad or a trend.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that one of the things that's critically important when we think about housing options for people is that they are housing options. So that this is one of a range of housing options. Apartments are housing options, single-family homes are housing options, tiny homes are housing options. And more, we need to be really aware that we're able to offer people a variety of options to choose from, and that this is one they would choose. So I think part of it also will be, is this a choice people make? Is this a choice they will continue to want? And I think that'll be part of the answer on it as well.
Yeah, and this gets back to, again, about establishing a long-term market for the tiny homes. So I do think there is, other movements that can become aligned with this, the co-housing movement, the supportive housing movement, obviously, and others that there can be some alignment. The other thing that you have to do is really address those barriers too, to make it easier for developers to build this type of housing. If we are able to establish that people want to live in a tiny home, or they want to live in this sort of community, I think you'll be able to get beyond the fad, but you still have to address the long term. To scale it, you're going to have to deal with these barriers about how do you have to, it can't be redone, you can't go for a zoning change every time. So we have to start to open up our zoning codes, our building codes for this type of solution too, why we're also working on establishing the marketplace. But to me, the marketplace is going to dictate, and I do believe there are many more individuals that are thinking about reducing their footprint, their carbon footprint, versus increasing their carbon footprint.
And I think we just need to identify who's going to make that jump and take that risk to go through that. So who are if it's homeless youth providing agencies, housing agencies that will take that jump, who's going to take it, and how can we collectively support them to ensure that the housing is ultimately successful?
Okay. Another thing that I kind of wanted to talk about with you all, especially, gentrification is an issue in every large city, including Chicago. And then that coupled with the segregation that already exists in this city, it makes the idea of building new neighborhoods and bringing in new people kind of a hot button or frustrating conversation to have with people who are already living in a community. So are there any tips that you would have for people trying to move into new communities? Do you have any methods that you put in place to talk to the people in the community already to make sure that they know that this is not like the beginning of a Starbucks takeover, or it's not the end of their community as they know it?
Well, I think with all affordable housing, whether it's supportive housing or affordable housing, the first step is always the conversation with the community. A lot of times that leads to NIMBY issues that you have to address, but sometimes it's a conversation that doesn't. But it's a real challenge in thinking about that and thinking about communities. And it's hard to know, where you cite the project will depend on whether there are issues around gentrification, whether you're part of gentrification. So I think it really is about the conversation with the community. I don't know that there's one way it always works, but I think that understanding who's being housed and why, and I don't think I can emphasize enough how important it is that your neighbors know how well the property will be taken care of to address NIMBY issues is critically important, and how it's adding to the community and not taking away, but that's always the fear for people on many different levels.
Yeah, and I've cited, about 1,500 units of affordable housing. The NIMBY issue always comes up, whether it doesn't make a difference what community you're working in. I always tried to, I think first Katrina's point about, some of the earlier points about design, I think many people are just very concerned about the design and how it's going to look within the community. Is it going to stand out as an institution or just as a sore thumb for the community as a starting point? So don't underemphasize that aspect, and because if you don't get beyond that, you're not going to get to the next level of discussion. And to me, as I always approached it, I approached it using sort of a bell curve type approach. I always knew there was probably 10% of that community that was never going to support me, no matter what I was doing. 10% of the community that was going to support me, no matter what I was doing. I was trying to appeal and activate the 80% in the middle, because they're the folks who, at the end of the day, they might have, one of their relative who is impacted by homelessness or mental health issues or anything that's there. But I think, again, trying to appeal to that middle part of the bell curve and to the concerned resident was the approach that we took. And we had to be very open and transparent in our discussions about how we were going to maintain this, what types of services were going to be provided. But they're not easy discussions, but I think, as Katrina pointed out, you have to be very, very transparent about them.
I think it's a function of education and organizing. You try to educate your potential adversaries, and you certainly want to organize your base. But I think also part of organizing is to organize for public policy change. And if you have public policy behind you, you hope to have the leadership behind you, the community leadership, but also the elected officials. And that goes a long way. It harkens to me back to the scattered site situation. And I remember in Hiawatha Park, we were trying to create scattered sites there, and the aldermen organized the community against it. CHA had bought some property and ended up having to give it up. So I think it's really a function of education and organizing.
And I think we'll have the added challenge in that this is new and innovative, and in that I think some of the lessons that we've learned before have been, how do we ensure that this kind of blends in? And because this is so new and innovative, our messaging will have to be refined in that piece.
Okay. because you all are mentioning policy and laws and politicians and all of those wonderful things that we always talk about here in Chicago, do you have any suggestions or any topics that you feel like need to be mentioned when you're discussing not only zoning laws but other policies or legal obstacles that you may face when trying to establish tiny homes here in Chicago?
Just to echo some of the other things that have been mentioned, but I think meeting with aldermen and talking with aldermen about the idea is also really important. It's not only zoning, but it's also who gives you the permission to site the housing. And in Chicago, it's the aldermen who make that decision, especially if you end up in a situation where you need special zoning permission. So the more education around educating aldermen, I think, would make a big difference.
And I think that there's significant pressure right now as we think about just how visible homelessness still continues to be in the city, and that we are still searching for concrete solutions. And so if this can be presented to the aldermen who are trying to find a solution within their own communities as well, that this could be a pathway forward.
I want to think sort of broader picture. Homelessness in the United States is largely a function of public policy. It was public policy in the 1980s that resulted in the large-scale homelessness that we see even today. And again, Ray Willis mentioned that homeless funding came about in 1987, and it was in the Reagan administration that caused the public policy shift that caused homelessness. And I think public policy is the solution to homelessness. Take a look at decisions that are made in cities like Salt Lake City, of all places, when they decided to use their Affordable Care Act dollars to be able to create rental assistance for their homeless. They housed their homeless and found that there were significant savings just in the health dollars. All I'm saying is that public policy caused the problem, and public policy can be the solution. And that applies to homelessness all around, but I think it can also apply to the various models like the tiny homes.
And then the only other thing I would add to this conversation about gentrification and policy, there's such a great body of knowledge in this community about how to serve people who are experiencing homelessness and develop new types of housing. And so even though the tiny homes idea is a new innovation, we can take what we've learned and tweak it towards this solution.
And I would agree with what Carlos was saying too, but I think one of the things relative to the housing finance system, we do have to start to really look at, the different standards. I mean, IDA has a different standard than HUD has, than the city of Chicago has around, they all might have to meet the housing quality standards, but, the size of the units, and Bill Pluto hit on that a little bit earlier. I think there needs to be some analysis and some real, somebody focusing in on where are those barriers to those pinch points in our housing finance system to really unlock the potential of this.
All right. And with that, we are out of time. So thank you very much to our panelists, and we'll keep it moving.